The fluorescent lights in Admiral Patricia Hayes' office hummed with an electrical tension that seemed to mirror the atmosphere in the room. Outside her window at Naval Base Norfolk, the morning sun cast long shadows across the pier, where destroyers and aircraft carriers sat like sleeping giants, their steel hulls reflecting the Virginia coastline. But inside this cramped administrative building, time felt suspended, caught between revelation and disbelief. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Lieutenant Sarah Chen stood before the Admiral's desk, her Navy dress blues impeccable despite the tremor in her hands. The 28-year-old naval engineer had requested this meeting 3 times over the past month, each request denied or delayed, until finally, this Tuesday morning in October, Admiral Hayes had grudgingly agreed to 15 minutes. Sarah had practiced her words countless times in the mirror of her base quarters, but now, facing the woman whose silver hair and steel-gray eyes commanded respect throughout the Pacific Fleet, those rehearsed phrases seemed inadequate. "Ma'am," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the storm building in her chest, "I need to show you something that's been happening aboard the USS Leviathan, something that Command has been overlooking." Admiral Hayes leaned back in her leather chair, fingers steepled. At 54, she had broken more barriers than she cared to count, becoming the first woman to command a carrier strike group in the Pacific. Her office walls bore testament to 3 decades of service. Commendations, photographs with presidents and foreign dignitaries, a folded flag from her father's funeral. He'd been a Navy man, too, lost in Vietnam when she was 12. She'd learned early that the Navy demanded perfection, especially from women, and she delivered it without complaint. "Lieutenant Chen, I've reviewed your service record. Exemplary performance in nuclear engineering, top of your class at Naval Academy, recommendation letters that read like poetry. You've got a bright future ahead of you." The Admiral's voice carried the weight of authority, but also something softer. Maternal concern, perhaps. "Whatever this is about, we can handle it through proper channels. There's no need for dramatics." Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She'd heard those words before. Proper channels. From Captain Morrison, from Commander Walsh, from every officer she'd tried to reach over the past 8 months. The proper channels had become a labyrinth designed to exhaust complainants into silence. But the burns on her torso told a different story, one that couldn't be filed away or dismissed with bureaucratic pleasantries. "With respect, ma'am, the proper channels have failed." Sarah's voice gained strength, each word carefully measured. "What's happening on the Leviathan isn't just misconduct. It's systematic abuse disguised as hazing, and it's escalating." The Admiral's expression didn't change, but her fingers drummed once against the desk, a tell that Captain Jennifer Martinez, sitting quietly in the corner taking notes, recognized from years of serving under Hayes. Martinez had been asked to witness this meeting, though neither she nor the Admiral had been told why. At 42, Martinez commanded the respect of every sailor who'd served under her, known for her fairness and her ability to read between the lines of military protocol. "Hazing," Admiral Hayes repeated slowly, "is a serious accusation. Do you have documentation, witness statements, physical evidence?" Sarah reached for the bottom of her uniform blouse with hands that shook despite her resolve. The fabric rustled in the silence as she began to lift it, revealing first the standard issue white t-shirt beneath, then skin that should have been unmarked by anything more serious than the occasional training scrape. Instead, a constellation of circular burns marked her lower back and sides, each one the precise diameter of a cigarette, some fresh with the angry red of recent wounds, others faded to silver scars that spoke of months of torture. The pattern wasn't random. It formed letters barely visible unless you knew to look for them. "Traitor," spelled out across her ribs in deliberate, methodical cruelty. Captain Martinez drew in a sharp breath, her pen clattering to the floor. Admiral Hayes rose from her chair, as if pulled by invisible wires, her composed facade cracking like ice under pressure. In 30 years of naval service, through combat deployments and humanitarian crises, she'd seen the aftermath of war and the price of duty. But this violation of trust, this perversion of the brotherhood that was supposed to protect those who served, struck her with the force of a physical blow. "Jesus Christ," the Admiral whispered, her voice barely audible. Then, louder, with the authority of command returning, "Captain Martinez, clear my schedule. Cancel everything, and get me a secure line to Washington." Sarah let her shirt fall back into place, her face pale but determined. "Ma'am, there's more. I'm not the only one. There are 7 other women aboard the Leviathan who've been marked like this. Some worse. And the men doing it, they're not random troublemakers. They're senior petty officers, chiefs, men who've been protected by a system that doesn't want to see what's happening." The Admiral was already reaching for her phone, but Sarah's words stopped her mid-motion. 7 others. The number hit like a sledgehammer, reverberating through the small office. Captain Martinez had retrieved her pen and was writing furiously, documenting everything, but her face had gone ashen. She'd served on ships with mixed crews for 15 years, had dealt with her share of harassment and discrimination, but nothing like this. "Names," Admiral Hayes commanded, her voice now carrying the full weight of flag rank. "I need names. Victims, perpetrators, witnesses, everyone who knew and said nothing." Sarah pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket. Not regulation, but she'd learned that regulation hadn't protected her or her shipmates. "I've documented everything, ma'am. Dates, times, witnesses present. I've also noted which officers were informed and what actions they took or didn't take." The list was longer than Admiral Hayes had feared. As she scanned the names, she recognized several officers she'd commended, men she'd trusted with the lives of hundreds of sailors. The betrayal cut deep, but beneath the personal pain was something harder. The cold fury of a commander discovering that her ship's company, the extended family of the United States Navy, had been harboring predators. Captain Martinez stood and moved closer to read over the Admiral's shoulder. The pattern was clear once you saw it. Reports filed and buried. Victims transferred to different divisions under the guise of better opportunities. Whistleblowers finding themselves assigned to the worst duties, or facing sudden performance reviews that threatened their careers. It was systematic, protected, and it had been happening for over 2 years. "The USS Leviathan," Admiral Hayes said, her voice taking on the measured cadence of someone making life-altering decisions, "is my responsibility. Every sailor aboard her is under my protection, and I have failed them." She looked up at Sarah, seeing not just a lieutenant, but a daughter, a sister, a representation of every woman who'd ever worn the uniform with pride, only to have that pride twisted into shame by those who should have protected her. "Ma'am," Sarah said quietly, "permission to speak freely?" "Granted. You didn't fail us. The system failed us. But right now, today, you have the chance to fix it. Not just for me, not just for the 7 others, but for every woman who'll serve after us. The question is, are you willing to burn down everything that allowed this to happen, even if it means ending careers of people you've known for decades?" The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of consequences neither woman could fully foresee. Outside, a helicopter approached the base, its rotors beating a rhythm that seemed to count down the seconds until everything changed. Admiral Hayes looked at the phone in her hand, then at Captain Martinez, then back at Lieutenant Chen. "Get me Admiral Thompson at the Pentagon," she said finally, her decision made. "Priority 1, Code Black. And Captain Martinez? Start preparing a comprehensive investigation team, full authority, unlimited resources, and immunity for anyone willing to come forward." As Captain Martinez rushed to comply, Admiral Hayes studied the young woman standing before her desk. Lieutenant Sarah Chen had just lit a fuse that would explode through the highest levels of naval command. Some would call her a hero. Others would label her a troublemaker who'd destroyed careers and tarnished the Navy's reputation. But standing there in her perfectly pressed uniform, bearing her scars with dignity, she looked like something more fundamental. A sailor who'd kept faith with her oath even when her Navy had broken faith with her. "Lieutenant," the Admiral said as she waited for the call to connect, "you realize this can't be undone. Once I make this call, there's no going back. Your life, your career, everything changes." Sarah nodded, her hand unconsciously moving to cover the burns beneath her uniform. "Ma'am, my life changed 8 months ago when Chief Petty Officer Barnes held a lit cigarette to my skin because I refused his advances. My career changed when I reported it, and was told I was oversensitive and not understanding Navy traditions. Everything's already changed." Now we're just deciding whether it changes for the better." The phone rang once, twice, then connected with the crisp efficiency of military communications. Admiral Thompson's office. "This is Admiral Hayes at Norfolk. I need to speak with the Admiral immediately. Tell him it's about conduct unbecoming and systematic abuse of personnel. Tell him I have physical evidence and multiple victims, and I need a full investigation team on the ground within 24 hours. As she spoke, Admiral Hayes watched Sarah's reflection in the window that overlooked the harbor. The young officer's face showed relief mixed with terror, the expression of someone who just stepped off a cliff, knowing that either wings would appear or the ground would rush up to meet her. But there was something else there too, hope. For the first time in 8 months, Lieutenant Sarah Chen looked hopeful. The burn marks hidden beneath her uniform would heal, leaving scars that might fade but would never completely disappear. But in this moment, as Admiral Hayes spoke words that would trigger investigations, court-martials, and sweeping reforms, those scars transformed from symbols of victimization into evidence of survival. Sarah had not just endured, she had kept fighting long enough to find someone willing to listen, someone with the power and courage to act. The morning sun continued its journey across the Virginia sky, but inside Admiral Hayes' office, everything had changed. A secret had been exposed, justice demanded, and the long process of healing for Sarah, for her fellow victims, and for the Navy itself had finally begun. But who had protected the predators for so long, and how high did the conspiracy reach? Sarah Chen's quarters aboard the USS Leviathan had once felt like a sanctuary. The small space, barely large enough for a narrow bunk, a tiny desk, and a wall locker, had been her refuge during her first deployment. She decorated it carefully, a photograph of her parents at her Naval Academy graduation, their faces beaming with pride as they stood flanked by the gray stone buildings of Annapolis, a small jade Buddha that had belonged to her grandmother, and a miniature American flag that she'd carried through officer candidate school. Now, 18 months later, those same decorations felt like relics from another life. The photograph reminded her of promises she'd made to herself and her family. Promises about honor, duty, and serving something greater than herself. The Buddha, meant to bring peace and wisdom, seemed to mock her nightly struggles with insomnia and hypervigilance. And the flag reminded her that she'd sworn an oath to defend principles that her own shipmates seemed determined to destroy. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, call sign Spark, a nickname earned during her first engineering crisis when she'd literally sparked an electrical panel back to life with nothing but wire strippers and determination, had grown up in San Francisco's Sunset District. Her parents, Dr. Michael Chen and Professor Lisa Wong Chen, had immigrated from Taiwan in the 1980s, bringing with them an unwavering faith in American opportunity and an absolute devotion to excellence. Their daughter would be a doctor, they'd planned, or perhaps a lawyer. When Sarah announced her intention to attend the Naval Academy, her mother had wept, not from disappointment, but from a complex mixture of pride and terror that her only daughter would choose a path so fraught with danger and discrimination. "The military is not made for people like us," her mother had said during Sarah's final week before leaving for Annapolis. They'd been walking through Golden Gate Park, watching the fog roll in from the Pacific, when Lisa stopped beside the AIDS Memorial Grove and turned to her daughter with eyes that held the weight of immigrant experience. "We are always guests, even in our own country. In the military, you will be a guest among guests, and some will never forgive you for wearing the same uniform they do." Sarah had dismissed her mother's concerns with the confidence of youth and idealism. She'd graduated third in her class from the academy, earned her nuclear engineering certification with the highest scores in her group, and received assignment to one of the Navy's most advanced destroyers. For her first year aboard the Leviathan, her mother's warnings had seemed unnecessarily pessimistic. Sure, she'd encountered the usual skepticism about women in engineering spaces, but her competence had quickly won over most of her colleagues. Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez had become a mentor, teaching her the practical aspects of shipboard life that no textbook could convey. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Walsh had taken her under her wing, showing her how to navigate the complex social dynamics of naval hierarchy. The first sign of trouble had been subtle, so subtle that Sarah had almost convinced herself she was imagining it. Chief Petty Officer Barnes, the senior enlisted man in her division, had begun finding reasons to work closely with her during the midnight watch. At first, his attention had seemed professional, even flattering. Barnes was a 20-year veteran, respected throughout the ship for his technical expertise and leadership. When he'd started suggesting they review maintenance schedules in private spaces, Sarah had assumed he was mentoring her, preparing her for future command responsibilities. The shift had happened gradually, like a tide changing direction. Barnes's mentorship had become increasingly personal, his questions moving from technical matters to her personal life, her relationships, her plans after the Navy. He'd started touching her shoulder during conversations, standing too close when reviewing blueprints, making comments about her appearance that walked the fine line between compliment and harassment. Sarah had tried to address it professionally, the way her academy training had taught her. She'd spoken to Barnes directly, clearly stating her boundaries and requesting that their interactions remain strictly professional. His response had been a masterclass in gaslighting. He'd expressed surprise and disappointment that she'd misinterpreted his mentorship, suggested that perhaps she wasn't mature enough for the responsibilities he'd been giving her, and begun treating her with cold formality that made her question her own perceptions. The night everything changed, Sarah had been working alone in the engine room during the mid-watch, reviewing coolant system readings that had shown minor irregularities during the day shift. The Leviathan was 3 weeks into a 6-month deployment in the Western Pacific, and the ship's routine had settled into the familiar rhythm of long-distance operations. At 0230 hours, with most of the crew asleep and only essential personnel on duty, the engine room felt like the safest place on the ship. A cathedral of machinery where problems had logical solutions and hard work yielded predictable results. Barnes had appeared without warning, moving with the silent confidence of someone who belonged everywhere on the ship. He'd been drinking. Not enough to be obviously intoxicated, but enough to lower whatever inhibitions had previously constrained him. What followed had shattered Sarah's understanding of herself, her place in the Navy, and the nature of the institution she'd sworn to serve. "You've been avoiding me, Lieutenant," Barnes had said, positioning himself between Sarah and the exit. "That hurts my feelings. Here I am, trying to help you succeed, and you act like I'm some kind of predator." Sarah had tried to maintain professionalism, even as alarm bells rang in her head. "Chief, I appreciate your guidance, but I think we should keep our interactions focused on duty requirements." Barnes had laughed, a sound that would echo in Sarah's nightmares for months afterward. "Duty requirements. You sound like a textbook, Lieutenant." But textbooks don't teach you how to really succeed in the Navy. That takes personal connections. He'd moved closer, close enough that Sarah could smell the alcohol on his breath and see the predatory calculation in his eyes. "You're smart, Lieutenant. Smarter than most of the officers I've served under. But smart isn't enough. You need allies, protectors, people who understand how things really work." What happened next had lasted only minutes, but those minutes had compressed a lifetime of violation into a space too small to contain it. Barnes had grabbed Sarah's wrist when she'd tried to leave, his grip leaving bruises that would fade long before the psychological damage. He'd pressed her against the bulkhead, his body trapping her while his free hand roamed over her uniform with the casual entitlement of someone who'd never been told no. Sarah had fought not the clean, decisive combat moves they'd taught her at the academy, but the desperate, clawing struggle of someone drowning in hostile water. She'd managed to break free, managed to put distance between them, managed to grab a wrench that she'd held like a weapon while Barnes had reorganized himself and his story. "You're confused, Lieutenant," he'd said, straightening his uniform with practiced ease. "The stress of deployment affects everyone differently. Sometimes people imagine things that didn't happen. Sometimes they misinterpret friendly gestures. It would be unfortunate if you damaged your career over a misunderstanding." Sarah had reported the incident the next morning, following proper procedures and channels just as she'd been taught. Lieutenant Commander Walsh had listened with apparent sympathy, taken notes, and assured Sarah that the matter would be investigated thoroughly. The investigation had lasted 3 days and concluded that no misconduct had occurred. Barnes had been performing routine maintenance checks, and any physical contact had been accidental and professional in nature. But the real punishment had begun after the investigation closed. Sarah's duty assignments had shifted to the least desirable shifts and locations. Her performance evaluations, previously sterling, had suddenly noted concerns about her interpersonal skills and a, quote, ability to work effectively with senior enlisted personnel. Social invitations from fellow officers had dried up, replaced by polite but distant professionalism that left her isolated in the small universe of the ship. The cigarette burns had started 3 weeks later. Sarah had been working alone again. She'd requested solitary assignments to avoid further incidents with Barnes, when she'd been cornered by a group of senior enlisted men from various departments. They'd called it correction therapy, a way to help her understand her place in the ship's hierarchy and the consequences of making false accusations against respected petty officers. The first burn had been applied with surgical precision, the cigarette held against the skin just above her hip while strong hands held her motionless. The pain had been indescribable, not just physical, but spiritual, a violation that cut deeper than nerve endings. They'd worked methodically. These men who'd sworn the same oath she had, branding her with their contempt and their absolute confidence that no one would stop them. "This is what happens to troublemakers," one of them had whispered as the cigarette found fresh skin. "This is what happens to women who don't know their place." Night after night the sessions had continued. Sometimes it was Barnes alone, sometimes a group, but always the same routine: isolation, restraint, and the deliberate application of pain designed not just to hurt, but to mark, to claim, to transform her body into a canvas for their hatred. They'd told her exactly what would happen if she reported the burns. More investigations that would find no evidence, more questions about her mental state, more isolation from colleagues who would see her as a problem to be avoided. Sarah had endured for months, protecting the other women on the ship by absorbing the worst of the abuse herself. She'd developed elaborate routines to hide the burns: special undershirts, carefully chosen uniforms, strategic positioning during medical exams. She'd perfected the art of sleeping while remaining alert, of appearing normal while screaming internally, of maintaining military bearing while her soul crumbled piece by piece. The breaking point had come when she discovered she wasn't alone. Seaman Apprentice Maria Rodriguez, Chief Rodriguez's daughter, who'd followed her father into the Navy with stars in her eyes and patriotism in her heart, had approached Sarah during a port call in Singapore with familiar fear in her eyes and familiar marks hidden beneath her uniform. Then Petty Officer Second Class Jennifer Kim, a communication specialist whose technical brilliance had earned her early promotion and unwanted attention. Then Electronics Technician First Class Amanda Williams, whose only crime had been refusing to laugh at increasingly graphic jokes about women's role in the military. 7 women in total, all bearing similar scars, all trapped in the same web of systematic abuse and institutional indifference. They'd met in secret, sharing stories that were horrifyingly similar: the same predators, the same methods, the same absolute confidence that the system would protect the abusers and silence the victims. Some had tried reporting through official channels. Others had learned from watching Sarah's experience that official channels were designed to fail. But Sarah had also learned something else during those months of torment. She was stronger than she'd ever imagined. Each cigarette burn, each threat, each moment of violation had forged something unbreakable in her core. She'd discovered reserves of courage she'd never known existed, and she'd realized that sometimes duty required more than following orders. Sometimes it required breaking them. The decision to request a meeting with Admiral Hayes had been born from that realization. Sarah knew it might end her career, might expose her to even worse retaliation, might brand her forever as the woman who destroyed the careers of decorated sailors. But she also knew that silence was complicity, that her oath to defend the Constitution included defending the principles of justice and protection for all who served under its flag. Now, sitting in Admiral Hayes' office with her scars finally exposed to daylight, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not the naive optimism of her academy days, but the harder, more valuable hope of someone who'd descended into darkness and found the strength to climb toward light. The burns would heal, leaving scars that would fade but never disappear. But the woman who bore those scars was no longer the idealistic lieutenant who'd first stepped aboard the Leviathan. Sarah Chen had been forged in fire. Not the clean flame of honest combat, but the twisted heat of betrayal and violation. She'd emerged from that crucible transformed, harder, wiser, and absolutely determined to ensure that no other woman would have to endure what she and her sisters had suffered. Her parents had taught her about duty and honor, the Naval Academy had taught her about leadership and sacrifice, but the men who'd tortured her had taught her the most valuable lesson of all. Sometimes, the greatest act of patriotism is refusing to let your country's uniform become a license for cruelty. The secure conference room in Admiral Hayes' headquarters building had been transformed into a war room within 6 hours of her call to Washington. Maps of the Western Pacific covered one wall, while another displayed organizational charts of the USS Leviathan's crew, red pins marking suspected perpetrators and blue pins indicating victims and witnesses. Captain Martinez supervised the installation of encrypted communication equipment, while a steady stream of investigators from Naval Criminal Investigative Service filed in with boxes of files and laptop computers. Admiral Thompson himself had flown down from the Pentagon, arriving with a team of senior investigators and a mandate that came directly from the Chief of Naval Operations. This would be handled swiftly, thoroughly, and with complete transparency. The political implications were staggering. Sexual assault scandals had already rocked other service branches, and Congress was watching naval leadership with microscopic attention. But Thompson had made it clear to Hayes that politics were secondary to justice. If they didn't clean house themselves, someone else would do it for them. Lieutenant Sarah Chen sat at the far end of the conference table. Medical documentation spread before her, while a Navy photographer carefully documented each burn mark under the supervision of Dr. Captain Rebecca Foster, the Pacific Fleet's chief medical officer. The process was clinical, necessary, and deeply humiliating. Even in the service of justice, Sarah's body was being examined, catalogued, and turned into evidence by strangers who spoke about her injuries in detached professional voices. The scarring patterns are consistent with deliberate torture, Dr. Foster reported to the assembled investigators. These weren't accidental injuries or the result of hazing gone wrong. Someone with medical knowledge planned these burns to maximize pain while minimizing permanent damage. The precision suggests either medical training or considerable practice on other victims. Admiral Hayes felt her jaw clench as she listened to the clinical assessment. Each technical detail was another nail in the coffin of officers she'd trusted, men who'd eaten at her table and shared her confidence. But beneath the professional betrayal was something deeper, a maternal fury at the systematic brutalization of a young woman who'd volunteered to serve her country. Lieutenant Chen, Admiral Thompson addressed Sarah directly, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades of command but softened with grandfatherly concern. I need you to walk us through the command structure aboard the Leviathan. Who knew about these incidents? Who should have known? Who actively participated in covering them up? Sarah had prepared for this moment during the sleepless nights that followed her decision to come forward. She'd memorized dates, times, witnesses present, and the exact words spoken during each incident. Her testimony would destroy careers, end marriages, and send decorated veterans to prison, but it would also protect future generations of women who dared to wear the uniform. Sir, the abuse began with Chief Petty Officer Barnes, but it was coordinated by Senior Chief Petty Officer Williams and sanctioned by Command Master Chief Johnson. Lieutenant Commander Walsh knew about my initial complaint and chose to bury it. Commander Harrison received my written report about the cigarette burns and filed it without investigation. Captain Morrison was briefed on all incidents and made the decision to transfer victims rather than perpetrators. As Sarah spoke, investigators made notes and exchanged glances heavy with significance. Each name she mentioned represented not just an individual failure, but a systematic breakdown of the military justice system. The web of complicity extended from the lowest enlisted ranks to the highest levels of shipboard command, protected by a culture that valued reputation over justice and silence over accountability. Admiral Thompson's aide, Commander Patricia Wells, had been tasked with tracking down the other victims Sarah had mentioned. Her first call had been to Seaman Apprentice Maria Rodriguez, who was currently stationed at Naval Base San Diego on temporary assignment. The conversation had lasted 45 minutes and ended with Rodriguez agreeing to fly to Norfolk immediately, despite the terror in her voice and her whispered confession that she'd been planning to leave the Navy rather than endure further abuse. The second victim, Petty Officer Second Class Jennifer Kim, had been harder to locate. Navy records showed her transferred to a communications facility in Guam, but when Wells had called, she discovered that Kim had requested emergency leave 3 weeks earlier and hadn't been heard from since. A missing person report had been filed, but it had somehow been classified as routine rather than urgent, another red flag that suggested the cover-up extended far beyond the Leviathan itself. Home, Electronics Technician First Class Amanda Williams had been the most challenging case. According to official records, she'd been transferred to shore duty in Jacksonville, Florida, following a psychological evaluation that deemed her for shipboard service. When Wells had finally reached Williams by phone, the conversation had been heartbreaking. Williams had been so traumatized by her experience that she could barely function in civilian settings, jumping at unexpected sounds and unable to sleep without nightmares. "They destroyed me," Williams had whispered into the phone, her voice hollow with despair. "I was a good sailor, Commander. I loved the Navy. I believed in what we were doing. But they took that away from me, piece by piece, burn by burn, and when I finally broke, they said I was the problem. They made it my fault." Each conversation had revealed new details about the systematic nature of the abuse. The perpetrators had developed a sophisticated network of protection, involving personnel in multiple departments and extending to shore-based commands that handled transfers and investigations. Victims who reported abuse found themselves transferred to undesirable assignments or subjected to psychological evaluations that questioned their fitness for duty. Witnesses who might have supported victims were intimidated into silence or transferred away from the ship entirely. The breakthrough came when Seaman Apprentice Rodriguez arrived at Norfolk and met privately with Sarah before her official testimony. The two women sat in a small office adjacent to the main conference room, finally able to speak freely about their shared experience without fear of immediate retaliation. "Sarah," Rodriguez said, her hands shaking as she accepted a cup of coffee, "there's something I never told you. Something I saw that night when they burned the word, traitor, into your skin." Sarah felt her stomach drop. That night had been one of the worst, when 5 senior enlisted men had held her down for over an hour, taking turns with lit cigarettes while discussing her attitude problem and the need for corrective training. She'd blocked out most of the details as a psychological survival mechanism, but Rodriguez's words brought it all flooding back. "Chief Johnson was there," Rodriguez continued, naming the ship's command master chief, the senior enlisted advisor to the captain, and theoretically the protector of all enlisted personnel aboard the ship. "He wasn't just watching, Sarah. He was directing them, telling them where to place the burns, how long to hold the cigarettes, what words to spell out. And," Rodriguez's voice broke, "and Captain Morrison was there too, in the passageway outside. He saw everything, heard everything, and then he just walked away." The revelation hit the investigation team like a bomb. Captain Morrison wasn't just guilty of covering up abuse after the fact. He was an active participant in the torture of personnel under his command. The implications were staggering. How many other incidents had he witnessed or orchestrated? How many other victims had suffered under his command? How high did the conspiracy reach within the Pacific Fleet? Admiral Hayes felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She'd recommended Morrison for his command, had written glowing fitness reports that praised his leadership and judgment. She'd sent him holiday cards, had dinner with his family, had trusted him with the lives of 300 sailors. The betrayal was personal and professional, cutting to the heart of everything she believed about naval leadership and the bonds of military service. "Get me Captain Morrison on the phone," Admiral Hayes commanded, her voice carrying the cold fury of someone who'd discovered ultimate betrayal. "I want him here tomorrow morning. Full dress uniform, and I want his service record, his fitness reports, every efficiency report he's ever filed, and a complete roster of every ship he's ever served on." The investigation was expanding exponentially. Each victim's testimony revealed new perpetrators, new incidents, new failures of leadership and accountability. What had begun as a case of sexual harassment aboard a single ship was becoming a systemic examination of naval culture and the protection afforded to predators who wore the uniform. Congressional liaisons were briefing House and Senate Armed Services committees. Media affairs officers were preparing for inevitable news leaks. And the Navy's top leadership was coming to grips with a scandal that could reshape the entire service. But in the midst of the institutional chaos, smaller human dramas were playing out. Maria Rodriguez had called her father, Chief Petty Officer Eduardo Rodriguez, the night before her testimony. The conversation had been devastating. A daughter telling her father, a 25-year Navy veteran, that the institution he'd devoted his life to had systematically abused and tortured his child. "Mija," Chief Rodriguez had wept into the phone from his duty station in Pearl Harbor, "I am so sorry. I taught you to trust the Navy, to believe in honor and duty and taking care of shipmates. I put you in harm's way because I believed in something that betrayed you." Rodriguez's anguish was shared by thousands of Navy families as news of the investigation began to leak through informal channels. Parents who'd proudly watched their daughters take the oath of enlistment were confronting the possibility that they'd delivered their children to predators. Spouses of suspected perpetrators were grappling with the realization that the men they'd married might be capable of systematic torture. Children were asking why daddy wasn't coming home, why mommy was crying, why the neighbors were whispering. The human cost of the cover-up was becoming clear as investigators dug deeper into the pattern of abuse. Jennifer Kim, the missing communications specialist, was found 3 days later in a motel room in Guam, catatonic from a combination of prescription medications and alcohol. Her suicide note, written in careful block letters on Navy stationery, had contained a single sentence: "I served with honor until honor abandoned me." Amanda Williams, the electronics technician whose career had been destroyed by her refusal to remain silent, had lost her security clearance, her technical certifications, and her faith in the justice system. She was working nights at a convenience store in Jacksonville, struggling with PTSD and survivor's guilt while living in a studio apartment that she could barely afford. Her mother had driven down from North Carolina to take care of her, abandoning her own job to nurse a daughter who flinched at the sound of male voices and woke up screaming from nightmares. The perpetrators, meanwhile, were being systematically isolated and investigated. Chief Petty Officer Barnes, the man who'd first assaulted Sarah, was placed in pretrial confinement pending court-martial proceedings. His wife had filed for divorce within hours of his arrest, taking their 2 young children and fleeing to her mother's house in Ohio. His Navy housing was searched by NCIS agents who found a collection of photographs documenting various hazing incidents, evidence that suggested the abuse had been both widespread and carefully documented. Senior Chief Petty Officer Williams, the man Sarah identified as coordinating the cigarette burning sessions, was found to have a previous sexual assault complaint from his last duty station, a complaint that had been resolved through administrative channels that resulted in the victim being transferred and Williams receiving a minor counseling entry in his record. The pattern was clear. The Navy had been shuffling predators from ship to ship rather than addressing their behavior, creating a system that protected abusers while abandoning victims. Command Master Chief Johnson, the senior enlisted leader who'd supposedly directed the torture sessions, initially denied all charges and demanded legal representation. His attorney, a Navy JAG officer named Lieutenant Commander Davis, had withdrawn from the case after reviewing the evidence, an unusual move that suggested the evidence was overwhelming. Johnson's replacement attorney was preparing an insanity defense, claiming that the stress of deployment had caused a complete psychological break. But the most shocking revelation came when investigators examined Captain Morrison's quarters aboard the Leviathan. Hidden in a locked drawer of his personal desk were detailed journals documenting not just the abuse aboard his current ship, but similar incidents from his previous commands. Morrison hadn't just witnessed torture, he'd been perfecting it for over a decade, treating his ships like personal laboratories for testing the limits of what he could do to subordinates without facing consequences. The journals revealed a systematic program of psychological and physical torture designed to maintain absolute control over ship's personnel. Morrison had identified women and men he considered problems, usually those who demonstrated independence, intelligence, or moral courage, and had developed techniques for breaking them down mentally and physically. The cigarette burns were just one tool in an arsenal that included sleep deprivation, forced labor, sexual humiliation, and social isolation. Reading Morrison's entries, Admiral Hayes felt physically ill. This wasn't the heat-of-the-moment abuse that might result from deployment stress or personal failings. This was calculated sadism, refined over years of practice, and protected by a system that valued order over justice. Morrison had written about his victims with clinical detachment, noting their psychological responses to different forms of torture and rating the effectiveness of various techniques for achieving submission. One entry, dated 6 months earlier, described Sarah's resistance to the cigarette burns with frustrated admiration. Subject continues to demonstrate unusual resilience. Standard physical intimidation has failed to achieve desired compliance. Recommend escalation to group sessions and symbolic marking to establish permanent psychological dominance. The language was that of a researcher documenting experiments, not a naval officer describing the treatment of subordinates. Morrison had transformed his ships into laboratories for studying human degradation. and the Navy had unknowingly provided him with a steady supply of test subjects who were legally bound to follow his orders and practically unable to escape his reach. As Admiral Thompson read selected excerpts aloud to the investigation team, the room fell into stunned silence. These weren't isolated incidents of bad judgment or failures of leadership. They were war crimes committed against American service members by their own commanders. The systematic nature of the abuse, the careful documentation, and the institutional protection afforded to Morrison suggested a conspiracy that reached far beyond a single ship or command. "How many ships?" Admiral Hayes asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "How many commands has Morrison held? How many victims are there?" Commander Wells consulted her laptop, scrolling through service records that painted an increasingly horrifying picture. Morrison has served as executive officer or commanding officer on 6 different ships over the past 15 years. Estimated personnel under his command: approximately 1,800 sailors. We're cross-referencing transfer requests, medical reports, and disciplinary actions to identify potential victims. The scale was overwhelming. 1,800 sailors who'd served under a commander who viewed them as experimental subjects rather than human beings deserving of protection and respect. Some would have escaped Morrison's attention, but many others would have experienced varying degrees of abuse: sexual harassment that never escalated to assault, psychological intimidation that stopped short of torture, or witnessing incidents that left them traumatized but unable to report what they'd seen. Sarah sat quietly during this discussion, processing the revelation that her personal nightmare was actually part of a much larger pattern of systematic abuse. She'd thought Barnes was the primary perpetrator, with Morrison as an incompetent commander who'd failed to protect his crew. The reality was far worse. Morrison was the architect of everything that had happened to her, and Barnes was simply one of his tools. "Lieutenant Chen," Admiral Thompson addressed her directly, "I need to ask you some difficult questions about your time aboard the Leviathan. Based on what we've discovered in Captain Morrison's journals, it's possible that your experiences were part of a larger experimental program. Can you recall any instances where your responses to abuse were observed or documented? Any times when perpetrators seemed to be testing different techniques or measuring your reactions?" Sarah closed her eyes, forcing herself to relive memories she'd spent months trying to suppress. Now that she understood the systematic nature of what had happened to her, patterns became visible that she'd previously attributed to random cruelty or individual sadism. "The cigarette burns weren't random," she said slowly, her voice gaining strength as understanding dawned. "They started small, just single burns on areas that would be hidden by my uniform. But each session built on the last one. Longer duration, more cigarettes, more men holding me down. It was like they were testing how much I could take before I broke." She paused, accessing memories that carried the weight of physical and emotional trauma. "And they documented everything. Chief Johnson always had a small notebook where he'd write down details after each session. What they'd done, how long I'd resisted, whether I'd cried or begged. I thought he was just keeping track for his own sick pleasure, but now we know he was keeping experimental data," Admiral Hayes finished grimly. "Data that Morrison was using to refine his techniques for breaking down other victims on other ships." The investigation team exchanged glances that conveyed both professional determination and personal horror. They'd uncovered not just a series of criminal acts, but a systematic program of human experimentation that violated every principle of military leadership and human decency. The implications extended far beyond the victims already identified. If Morrison had been conducting similar experiments on previous ships, there could be hundreds of survivors struggling with trauma they'd never been able to understand or report. Commander Wells was already coordinating with NCIS headquarters to launch investigations at Morrison's previous duty stations. The process would be massive, requiring interviews with thousands of former shipmates, reviews of medical records going back over a decade, and careful outreach to potential victims who might have spent years believing they were isolated cases rather than part of a systematic pattern. But even as the investigation expanded, the human drama continued to unfold in real time. Captain Morrison, confronted with evidence from his own journals, had initially attempted to claim the notebooks were fiction, creative writing exercises designed to help him understand the psychological pressures faced by deployed sailors. When confronted with corroborating physical evidence and victim testimony, he'd shifted to claiming the abuse was necessary discipline designed to maintain order aboard ship. These people were problems, Morrison had told investigators during his first formal interview, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone accustomed to absolute power over subordinates. The Chen woman was undermining morale with her constant complaints about harassment. The Rodriguez girl was spreading rumors about senior enlisted personnel. They needed correction, and sometimes correction requires physical reinforcement. His words, recorded and transcribed by Navy stenographers, would become key evidence in court-martial proceedings, but they also revealed the mindset that had allowed systematic torture to flourish within the naval command structure, the belief that absolute authority justified any action, and that subordinates who questioned that authority deserved whatever punishment their commanders deemed appropriate. The breaking point came when Maria Rodriguez testified before the full investigation panel. Unlike Sarah, who'd maintained her military bearing throughout the ordeal, Rodriguez broke down completely while describing the night she'd been gang-raped by 5 senior enlisted men while Morrison watched from the doorway. Her testimony, delivered between sobs that echoed through the secure conference room, painted a picture of systematic sexual violence that went far beyond the cigarette burns Sarah had endured. "They said I was lucky," Rodriguez whispered, her voice barely audible through tears. "Lucky because my father was Navy, because I came from a military family, because I understood tradition. They said civilian girls wouldn't understand why this was necessary, but I should be grateful for the lesson in military discipline." Admiral Hayes had to leave the room during Rodriguez's testimony, stepping into the hallway where she leaned against the wall and struggled to maintain her composure. In 30 years of naval service, through combat deployments and humanitarian crises, she'd never encountered evil so pure and systematic. The men who'd tortured Rodriguez and Sarah hadn't acted from passion or momentary loss of control. They'd planned and executed sexual violence with the same methodical precision they'd use for any military operation. Wait, Vodaplan. Captain Martinez found her there 10 minutes later, both women standing in silence while processing the magnitude of what they'd discovered. The Navy they'd devoted their careers to, the institution they'd believed represented the highest ideals of American service, had been harboring predators who used their authority to commit acts that would be considered war crimes if perpetrated against enemy prisoners. "How do we fix this?" Martinez asked quietly. "How do we rebuild trust in an institution that allowed systematic torture of its own people?" Admiral Hayes didn't have an answer. The investigation was uncovering evidence of criminal behavior that reached into the highest levels of naval command, protected by a culture that valued reputation over justice and silence over accountability. Courts-martial would punish individual perpetrators, but the system that had enabled them would require fundamental change that would face resistance from officers who'd built their careers within the existing structure. But as they stood in that hallway, processing the weight of institutional failure, Admiral Hayes made a decision that would define the remainder of her career. The Navy could court-martial Morrison and his accomplices, could implement new policies and training programs, could promise that such abuse would never happen again. Or it could choose the harder path: complete transparency, systematic reform, and a public acknowledgement that the institution had failed in its most fundamental duty to protect those who served. "We're going to do this right," Admiral Hayes said finally, her voice carrying the weight of command decision. "Full disclosure, complete transparency, and reforms that actually prevent this from happening again. Even if it means admitting that we failed these women, failed their families, and failed every sailor who trusted us to maintain honor and dignity in naval service." The decision would cost Admiral Hayes her career. She knew that even as she made it. The Navy's senior leadership preferred quiet resolution to public accountability, and her insistence on transparency would be seen as disloyal to the institution. But standing there in that government hallway, thinking about Sarah Chen's scars and Maria Rodriguez's tears, Admiral Hayes realized that some principles were worth more than career advancement. The investigation would continue for months, ultimately identifying over 200 victims across Morrison's various commands and uncovering a network of abuse that reached into multiple ships and shore installations. Congressional hearings would follow, along with media coverage that would force the Navy to confront uncomfortable truths about its culture and leadership. Reforms would be implemented, training programs established, and policies changed to protect future generations of sailors. But none of that would undo the damage already inflicted on women like Sarah Chen, who'd volunteered to serve their country only to discover that their greatest enemy wore the same uniform they did. The scars would fade, the nightmares would eventually lessen, but the fundamental breach of trust between service member and institution would take decades to heal. As Admiral Hayes returned to the conference room to continue hearing testimony that would destroy careers and shatter reputations, she carried with her a renewed understanding of what military leadership actually meant. It wasn't about commanding ships or winning battles or advancing through ranks. It was about protecting those who'd placed their trust in the institution, even when that protection came at personal cost. Sarah Chen was still testifying when the Admiral resumed her seat, still answering questions with the precise attention to detail that had made her an outstanding naval officer. Her voice was steady, her bearing professional, but her hands occasionally moved to cover the places where cigarettes had burned letters into her skin, letters that spelled out the word traitor in scars that would never completely disappear. The irony wasn't lost on Admiral Hayes. The real traitors weren't the women who'd been branded with that word, but the men who'd held the cigarettes. They'd betrayed every principle the Navy claimed to represent, every oath they'd sworn, every trust that had been placed in them. Sarah Chen and her fellow victims weren't traitors. They were patriots who'd endured torture rather than abandon their duty to protect others from similar abuse. The first court-martial began on a gray Monday morning in November, 6 weeks after Lieutenant Sarah Chen had lifted her shirt to show Admiral Hayes the burn marks that would ultimately reshape the United States Navy. The proceedings were held in a sterile courtroom at Naval Station Norfolk, its oak paneling and brass fixtures lending an air of solemn dignity to what would become one of the most significant military justice cases in decades. Captain Richard Morrison sat at the defendant's table in his dress blue uniform, stripped of command insignia but still carrying the bearing of a man accustomed to absolute authority. His civilian attorney, a former Navy JAG officer named Michael Brennan, had advised him to accept a plea bargain that would have resulted in dismissal from service and a brief prison sentence. Morrison had refused, insisting on a full trial that would allow him to, quote, tell his side of the story and expose what he called the, quote, conspiracy of weak-minded personnel who couldn't handle real military discipline. The prosecution team, led by Captain Jennifer Walsh from the Navy JAG Corps, had spent weeks preparing a case that would demonstrate not just Morrison's individual guilt, but the systematic nature of the abuse he'd orchestrated. The evidence was overwhelming. Morrison's own journals documenting torture sessions, medical records of burn patterns that matched his written descriptions, and victim testimony that revealed a pattern of behavior spanning multiple commands over 15 years. Sarah Chen was the first witness called to testify, walking to the witness stand with the measured pace she'd learned during countless military formations. She wore her dress blues with full ribbons, a visual reminder that the woman taking the oath to tell the truth had served her country with distinction before becoming the victim of systematic abuse. Her parents sat in the gallery's front row, having flown across the country to support their daughter through the most difficult testimony she would ever give. Lieutenant Chen, Captain Walsh began, her voice carrying the formal cadence of military legal proceedings. Please tell the court about the first incident of abuse you experienced aboard the USS Leviathan. Sarah had rehearsed this moment for weeks, working with prosecutors and victim advocates to prepare testimony that would be both legally effective and personally survivable. But sitting in the witness box, facing Morrison across the courtroom while cameras recorded every word for historical posterity, she felt the weight of speaking not just for herself but for every woman who'd ever suffered in silence within military ranks. Ma'am, the first incident occurred on March 15th of last year, during the midnight watch in the engine room. Chief Petty Officer Barnes cornered me while I was reviewing coolant system readings and attempted to sexually assault me. When I fought him off and threatened to report the incident, he told me that no one would believe me, and that making accusations against senior enlisted personnel would destroy my career. As Sarah spoke, Morrison's defense attorney made notes while occasionally glancing at his client. Morrison himself sat motionless, his face showing no emotion, as the woman he'd ordered tortured described the beginning of her ordeal in clinical detail. His apparent indifference to her suffering was noted by the panel of officers serving as jury, senior Navy personnel who understood the bonds of trust that were supposed to exist between commanders and subordinates. Lieutenant Chen, what happened when you reported Chief Barnes's assault through proper channels? Ma'am, I filed a formal complaint with Lieutenant Commander Walsh the following morning. She assured me the matter would be investigated thoroughly, but after 3 days I was informed that no misconduct had occurred. The investigation concluded that any physical contact had been accidental and professional in nature. Sarah's testimony continued for over 2 hours, detailing not just the initial assault, but the systematic retaliation that had followed. She described the duty assignment changes that isolated her from potential allies, the performance evaluations that suddenly found fault with previously exemplary service, and the social ostracism that left her without support systems during the most difficult period of her life. But the most devastating portion of her testimony concerned the cigarette burns themselves. Working from photographs and medical documentation, Sarah walked the court through each torture session, identifying the personnel involved and describing Morrison's role as both observer and director of the abuse. The defendant was present during the longest session, which occurred on August 23rd. Sarah testified, her voice remaining steady despite the trauma of reliving those moments. He gave specific instructions about where to place the burns to spell out letters, how long to hold each cigarette to achieve the desired scarring, and what words should be burned into my skin to achieve maximum psychological impact. Morrison's attorney objected to the testimony as inflammatory and prejudicial, but the military judge overruled the objection. The court needed to understand not just what had been done to Lieutenant Chen, but why it had been done and who had ordered it. Morrison's own journals, entered as prosecution evidence, corroborated every detail of Sarah's account with clinical precision. The second day of testimony focused on the systematic nature of the abuse across Morrison's various commands. Commander Wells presented evidence from investigations at Morrison's previous duty stations, revealing a pattern of behavior that had evolved and intensified over 15 years of command positions. The prosecution had identified 47 victims across 6 ships, with documented cases ranging from sexual harassment to outright torture. Maria Rodriguez took the stand on the third day, her testimony delivered in a voice so quiet that court reporters had to ask her repeatedly to speak louder. Her account of gang rape, perpetrated while Morrison watched from the doorway, was interrupted frequently by breaks as Rodriguez struggled to maintain composure. Her father, Chief Petty Officer Eduardo Rodriguez, sat in the gallery with tears streaming down his face as his daughter described abuse that had occurred while he was unknowingly serving on another ship in the same fleet. "They told me it was an honor," Rodriguez whispered during the most difficult portion of her testimony. "An honor to serve the needs of senior personnel, an honor to be chosen for special attention, an honor to learn what military discipline really meant. They said my father would be proud if he knew I was receiving such thorough training in naval traditions." The prosecution's most damaging evidence came from Morrison's own writings, which revealed not just his participation in torture, but his philosophical justification for systematic abuse. Captain Walsh read selected excerpts to the court, Morrison's words condemning him more effectively than any victim testimony could. Traditional military discipline has been weakened by political correctness and sensitivity training that fails to prepare personnel for the realities of military service. True leadership requires the willingness to break down individual resistance and rebuild subordinates according to military necessity. Physical correction, properly applied, achieves results that counseling and administrative action cannot match. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The defense team, faced with overwhelming evidence of their client's guilt, attempted to argue that Morrison's actions, while extreme, were justified by the unique pressures of military command and the need to maintain discipline aboard ship. They presented character witnesses, former subordinates who testified that Morrison had been an effective leader who'd achieved impressive operational results. Captain Morrison ran a tight ship, testified Command Master Chief Peterson, who'd served under Morrison on a previous deployment. His methods might have been unconventional, but he got results. Ships under his command had the highest readiness ratings, the lowest disciplinary problems, and the best operational performance in the fleet. But the prosecution's cross-examination revealed the dark side of those impressive statistics. The lowest disciplinary problems had been achieved by terrorizing potential troublemakers into silence. The highest readiness ratings had come from crews who were too frightened to report equipment failures or safety concerns that might reflect poorly on their commander. The best operational performance had been built on a foundation of systematic abuse that had destroyed the careers and psychological health of dozens of service members. The prosecution also called Admiral Hayes as a witness, her testimony focusing on the institutional failures that had allowed Morrison's abuse to continue unchecked for over a decade. Her appearance in full dress uniform, with 4 stars gleaming on her shoulders, lent weight to her words as she described the systematic breakdown of military justice that had protected predators while abandoning victims. The Navy failed Lieutenant Chen and every other victim of Captain Morrison's abuse, Admiral Hayes testified, her voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. We created a system that valued reputation over justice, silence over accountability, and the careers of perpetrators over the welfare of victims. That failure starts with leadership, and as the senior officer responsible for this fleet, I accept full responsibility for our collective failure to protect those who deserved our protection. Admiral Hayes' willingness to accept institutional responsibility while testifying against Morrison was unprecedented in military court proceedings. Senior officers typically defended institutional decisions and supported subordinate commanders, even in cases of obvious misconduct. Her testimony sent shockwaves through the Navy's senior leadership and made clear that this case represented more than punishment for individual wrongdoing. It was a fundamental reckoning with military culture itself. The defense team's final strategy was to argue that Morrison had suffered a psychological breakdown caused by the cumulative stress of multiple combat deployments and command responsibilities. They presented expert testimony about post-traumatic stress disorder in military personnel and argued that Morrison's actions, while inexcusable, were the result of untreated mental illness rather than deliberate cruelty. Dr. Patricia Manning, a civilian psychiatrist specializing in military trauma, testified that Morrison exhibited classic symptoms of command stress that had gone undiagnosed and untreated for years. Captain Morrison's behavior represents a psychological break from reality caused by the accumulated trauma of military service, she told the court. His journals revealed dissociative episodes and grandiose delusions consistent with severe PTSD that manifested as a need to control his environment through extreme measures. But the prosecution's psychiatric expert, Navy Commander Dr. Robert Chen, no relation to Sarah, offered a different analysis. His evaluation of Morrison, conducted during pretrial confinement, had revealed not mental illness, but a sophisticated understanding of psychology that had been deliberately weaponized against subordinates. Captain Morrison demonstrates no signs of post-traumatic stress disorder or dissociative episodes, Dr. Chen testified. His journals reveal careful planning, methodical execution, and clear understanding of the psychological impact of his actions. He wasn't suffering from a mental health crisis. He was conducting deliberate psychological warfare against his own personnel. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Morrison himself took the stand in his own defense, against the advice of his attorneys. For 3 hours, he testified about his philosophy of military leadership, his belief that modern naval personnel lacked the toughness required for combat operations, and his conviction that extreme measures were necessary to prepare sailors for the realities of warfare. "I created warriors," Morrison declared from the witness stand, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who genuinely believed in his actions. "The women who served under my command learned lessons about resilience, discipline, and mental toughness that they could never have learned in sensitivity training sessions or diversity workshops. I prepared them for the reality that enemies will not respect their gender or their feelings." Captain Walsh's cross-examination dismantled Morrison's justifications with surgical precision, forcing him to confront the contradictions between his stated goals and actual outcomes. Far from creating warriors, his abuse had destroyed careers, ruined lives, and driven talented personnel out of naval service. The women he claimed to have toughened had suffered lasting psychological damage that prevented them from effectively serving their country. "Captain Morrison, can you explain how burning the word traitor into Lieutenant Chen's skin prepared her for combat operations?" Morrison's answer revealed the depth of his delusion. Lieutenant Chen needed to understand the consequences of disloyalty to the military hierarchy. In combat situations, personnel who question legitimate authority endanger entire units. Physical correction reinforces the absolute nature of military obedience. The prosecution's closing arguments focused on the systematic nature of Morrison's crimes and their impact on naval readiness and morale. Captain Walsh argued that Morrison hadn't strengthened the Navy through his actions. He'd weakened it by destroying the trust between commanders and subordinates that formed the foundation of military effectiveness. "This case isn't about one officer's poor judgment or excessive discipline," Walsh told the panel. "This is about a systematic program of torture conducted against American service members by their own commanders. Captain Morrison didn't prepare these women for war. He declared war on them. The defense's closing argument asked the panel to consider Morrison's distinguished service record, his operational achievements, and the possibility that his actions, while wrong, had been motivated by genuine concern for military readiness rather than personal cruelty. They argued for leniency based on his psychological state and his decades of otherwise exemplary service. But the panel's verdict, delivered after 8 hours of deliberation, reflected the weight of evidence and the unprecedented nature of Morrison's crimes. He was found guilty on all charges: systematic sexual assault, torture of subordinates, conduct unbecoming an officer, and violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The sentence was equally unprecedented: dismissal from naval service, forfeiture of all pay and benefits, and 25 years in federal prison. As the verdict was read, Sarah Chen sat in the gallery surrounded by her parents and fellow survivors, feeling a complex mixture of relief and emptiness. Justice had been served, but it couldn't undo the damage that had been inflicted or restore the innocence that had been lost. Morrison would go to prison, but the scars he'd carved into her body and soul would remain forever. Admiral Hayes, watching from the gallery as Morrison was led away in handcuffs, felt the weight of institutional transformation beginning. This trial was just the beginning. Dozens of other court-martials would follow, along with congressional hearings, media investigations, and reforms that would reshape military culture. The Navy she devoted her career to would emerge from this crisis fundamentally changed, forced to confront uncomfortable truths about power, accountability, and the protection owed to those who volunteered to serve. The courtroom emptied slowly, participants and observers processing the magnitude of what they'd witnessed. But outside the building, reporters waited with cameras and questions, ready to broadcast the story of systematic military abuse to a nation that was only beginning to understand the scope of the problem. Sarah Chen walked past the cameras without speaking, flanked by her parents and victim advocates who shielded her from the media attention. She'd testified truthfully and completely, had faced her tormentor in court, and watched justice being served. Now she needed to begin the harder work of healing, of rebuilding her life and career, and of learning to trust again in an institution that had both betrayed and ultimately protected her. The burn marks would fade over time, becoming thin white lines that most people would never notice. But the courage she'd shown in lifting her shirt in Admiral Hayes' office, exposing her scars to daylight and demanding justice, would inspire a generation of service members who would never have to suffer in silence as she had. Justice had been served, but the real work of reform was just beginning. 6 months after Captain Morrison's conviction, the USS Leviathan underwent the most comprehensive crew change in naval history. Every officer above the rank of lieutenant was reassigned, along with senior enlisted personnel who'd been identified as either perpetrators or enablers of systematic abuse. The ship itself was dry-docked for extensive modifications, not just to its physical systems but to its culture and command structure. Lieutenant Sarah Chen stood on the pier at Naval Base Norfolk, watching tugboats guide the Leviathan back to its berth after 3 months of repairs and retraining. She wore the uniform of a lieutenant commander now. Her promotion had come through ahead of schedule, a recognition of both her exceptional technical skills and her courage in exposing institutional corruption. But more importantly, she wore it with pride restored, her faith in the Navy's fundamental mission renewed through the comprehensive reforms that had followed Morrison's trial. The transformation hadn't been easy or complete. Congressional hearings had stretched through the winter and spring, with members of the House and Senate Armed Services Committees demanding explanations from Navy leadership about how systematic abuse had been allowed to flourish for over a decade. Admiral Hayes had testified for 6 hours before a joint committee, accepting full responsibility for institutional failures, while outlining the reforms being implemented to prevent similar abuse in the future. The United States Navy betrayed its sacred trust to protect those who volunteer to serve our nation. Admiral Hayes had told Congress her words broadcast live on C-SPAN and replayed on every major news network. We created a culture that protected predators and silenced victims, that valued reputation over justice and silence over accountability. That ends now, with comprehensive reforms that will ensure no sailor ever again faces the choice between suffering abuse in silence and destroying their career by reporting it. The reforms had been sweeping. Every ship in the Pacific Fleet underwent comprehensive inspections, not just of equipment and procedures, but of command climate and crew morale. Anonymous reporting systems were implemented, allowing sailors to report abuse without fear of retaliation. Victim advocates were assigned to every major command, with direct access to senior leadership and the authority to bypass chain of command when necessary. Most significantly, the Navy had adopted a zero-tolerance policy that made commanders personally responsible for the welfare and safety of all personnel under their authority. Officers who failed to prevent, investigate, or properly respond to abuse faced automatic relief from command and potential court-martial proceedings. The policy was nicknamed Sarah's Law by sailors throughout the fleet, though Sarah herself preferred the official designation, Command Accountability for Personnel Welfare. The human cost of the transformation had been enormous. Over 200 Navy personnel faced court-martial proceedings for their involvement in systematic abuse, with sentences ranging from reduction in rank to decades in federal prison. Dozens of senior officers saw their careers end in disgrace, their reputations destroyed, and their retirement benefits forfeited. Family members, spouses and children of convicted personnel, faced social ostracism and financial hardship as their loved ones were imprisoned or discharged under other than honorable conditions. But alongside the destruction of corrupt careers came the restoration of damaged lives. Maria Rodriguez had returned to active duty after extensive counseling and medical treatment, serving now as a victim advocate who helped other sailors navigate the reporting process without fear of retaliation. Her testimony during Morrison's trial had been so compelling that she'd been asked to speak at congressional hearings and military justice conferences, sharing her experience to help prevent similar abuse in the future. "I thought my military career was over when I reported what happened to me," Rodriguez told a gathering of Navy personnel at Norfolk. "I thought I was betraying my father's legacy and destroying my own future. But I learned that the real betrayal would have been staying silent and allowing other women to suffer what I had suffered. Speaking truth to power isn't betrayal. It's the highest form of loyalty to the principles our uniform represents." Amanda Williams, the electronics technician whose career had been destroyed by her refusal to remain silent, had been reinstated to active duty with full back pay and benefits. Her security clearance had been restored, her technical certifications renewed, and her service record cleared of the negative evaluations that had been fabricated to punish her for reporting abuse. She was now serving as a senior instructor at the Navy's Technical Training Center, teaching both electronics and ethics to new sailors entering the service. "They tried to break me," Williams said during her speech at the Navy's annual Sexual Assault Prevention Conference. "They took my career, my clearance, my reputation, and my faith in the institution I'd sworn to serve. But they couldn't take my integrity, and they couldn't take my commitment to protecting others from experiencing what I experienced. Every sailor I train now learns not just technical skills, but moral courage. The understanding that sometimes serving your country means standing up to your commanders when they forget what service actually means." The recovery hadn't been complete for everyone. Jennifer Kim, the communications specialist who'd been found catatonic in a Guam motel room, had medically retired from the Navy and was receiving ongoing treatment at a veterans hospital in California. Her suicide attempt had left lasting neurological damage that prevented her return to active duty, but she'd found purpose in working with military mental health programs to help other survivors access treatment and support. Some victims had chosen to leave the Navy entirely, their trust in the institution too damaged to repair. They'd received financial settlements and medical benefits, along with official apologies from Navy leadership, but their departure represented a permanent loss of talent and experience that the service could ill afford. Each resignation was a reminder that institutional redemption required more than policy changes. It demanded cultural transformation that would take years to fully achieve. The broader impact extended far beyond the Navy itself. The Morrison case had sparked similar investigations in other service branches, revealing patterns of systematic abuse that had been hidden or ignored for decades. The Army initiated comprehensive reviews of its training installations, uncovering widespread hazing and sexual assault that had been dismissed as tradition or character building. The Air Force restructured its approach to sexual assault prevention, implementing many of the reforms pioneered by the Navy's response to the Leviathan case. Congress had responded by passing the Military Justice Improvement Act, which removed sexual assault cases from the traditional chain of command and placed them under the jurisdiction of independent military prosecutors. The legislation, championed by senators who'd been horrified by testimony from Morrison's victims, represented the most significant reform of military justice since the creation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice in 1950. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural. The revelation that systematic abuse had flourished within one of America's most respected institutions had forced a national conversation about power, accountability, and the protection of those who served in positions of vulnerability. Military families began having different conversations with their children about service, emphasizing not just honor and duty, but the importance of moral courage and the obligation to protect fellow service members from abuse. Sarah herself had become an unwitting symbol of institutional transformation, her story cited in training programs and congressional testimony as an example of individual courage catalyzing systematic change. She'd received dozens of awards and commendations, including the Navy Cross, the service's second-highest decoration, for her extraordinary heroism in exposing systematic abuse and protecting fellow service members at great personal risk. The ceremony presenting her with the Navy Cross had been held at the Pentagon, with Admiral Hayes making the presentation and Sarah's parents watching from the front row. But the moment that meant the most to Sarah had come afterward, when a young sailor had approached her during the reception. "Ma'am," the sailor had said, her voice trembling with emotion, "my name is Seaman Apprentice Johnson. I've been having problems with my supervisor, and I didn't know what to do about it. But after hearing your story, I reported it to my victim advocate, and now I'm getting help. I just wanted to thank you for showing me that speaking up isn't betrayal, it's courage." That conversation had crystallized for Sarah why she'd chosen to remain in the Navy, despite the trauma she'd endured. Her decision to lift her shirt in Admiral Hayes' office hadn't just sought justice for past wrongs. It had created space for future generations of sailors to serve with dignity and safety. Each young woman who could now report abuse without fear of retaliation was a living testament to the power of individual courage to spark institutional change. The USS Leviathan itself had been transformed during its time in dry dock. The ship's commanding officer was now Captain Lisa Martinez, Admiral Hayes' former aide-de-camp, who'd witnessed Sarah's initial report. Martinez had been personally selected by the Chief of Naval Operations to oversee the ship's cultural transformation, implementing new policies and procedures designed to prevent the abuse that had flourished under Morrison's command. The ship's crew had been extensively retrained in professional conduct, victim advocacy, and bystander intervention. New reporting procedures allowed personnel to bypass their immediate supervisors when reporting abuse, preventing the kind of institutional cover-up that had protected Morrison and his accomplices. Anonymous feedback systems provided regular assessments of command climate, with results reported directly to fleet leadership rather than being filtered through potentially compromised local commanders. Most importantly, the ship's culture had been rebuilt around mutual respect and shared mission rather than fear and intimidation. Senior enlisted personnel were selected based not just on technical expertise, but on their commitment to mentoring junior sailors and protecting them from abuse. Officers were evaluated on their success in maintaining positive command climate, with promotion dependent on demonstrable commitment to personnel welfare as well as operational effectiveness. The transformation wasn't complete. Cultural change of this magnitude required years of sustained effort and constant vigilance against backsliding. But the early indicators were promising. Morale surveys showed dramatic improvements in crew satisfaction and trust in leadership. Retention rates for women and minorities had increased significantly, reflecting growing confidence that the Navy was serious about protecting all personnel regardless of gender or background. Admiral Hayes had paid a personal price for her decision to prioritize transparency and accountability over institutional reputation. Conservative elements within the Navy's senior leadership had never forgiven her for airing the Navy's dirty laundry in public, and she'd been passed over for promotion to Chief of Naval Operations, a position she'd been considered certain to attain before the Morrison case. But she'd accepted the career cost as necessary for institutional integrity, and her example had inspired other senior officers to prioritize justice over personal advancement. Leadership isn't about protecting your career or advancing your interests, Admiral Hayes had told a gathering of newly promoted admirals at the Naval War College. Leadership is about protecting those who can't protect themselves, even when that protection comes at personal cost. Every officer in this room has more power than Lieutenant Chen had when she decided to report systematic abuse. The question each of us must answer is, will we use that power to seek truth and justice, or will we use it to protect ourselves and our reputations? The speech had been recorded and distributed throughout the Navy as part of mandatory leadership training, ensuring that Hayes' message reached every officer in the service. Her words carried particular weight because everyone knew the personal cost she'd paid for acting on those principles. Her willingness to sacrifice career advancement for institutional integrity had validated her message in ways that abstract lectures on ethics never could. Sarah's own career had flourished in the post-Morrison Navy. Her promotion to lieutenant commander had come with assignment to the Naval Academy as an instructor in both nuclear engineering and military ethics, a dual role that allowed her to share technical expertise while helping shape the next generation of naval officers. Understanding of moral courage and institutional accountability. Standing before classes of midshipmen, Sarah found herself explaining not just the principles of nuclear reactor operation, but the principles that should guide military leadership. Her students knew her story. It had become part of academy curriculum, studied alongside other examples of individual courage changing institutional culture. But she was careful not to let her personal experience overshadow the broader lessons about duty, honor, and the obligation to protect subordinates. The hardest decision you'll face as officers won't be tactical or technical, Sarah told her advanced ethics seminar during the spring semester. It will be the moment when you have to choose between your career and your conscience, between institutional loyalty and moral courage. I'm here to tell you that choosing conscience over career isn't sacrifice. It's the essence of what it means to wear this uniform. Her students, young men and women preparing to lead sailors into uncertain futures, listened with the intensity of those who understood they were learning from someone who'd faced ultimate tests of character and emerged with integrity intact. Many would seek her out after class, sharing their own concerns about military culture or asking advice about how to prepare for the moral challenges they'd face as junior officers. The academy itself had been transformed by the lessons learned from the Morrison case. New courses in military ethics were mandatory for all midshipmen, with case studies drawn from real instances of institutional failure and individual courage. Sexual assault prevention training had been completely redesigned, moving beyond legalistic compliance to focus on bystander intervention and the creation of command climates that prevented abuse from occurring in the first place. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural. The Morrison case had shattered the assumption that institutional loyalty required silence about institutional failings. The new generation of officers was being taught that true loyalty sometimes required challenging superiors, that courage might mean risking career advancement to protect subordinates, and that the highest form of service was ensuring the military remained worthy of the trust placed in it by American citizens. Admiral Thompson, who'd flown down from the Pentagon on that October morning when Admiral Hayes had first called Washington, had been promoted to Chief of Naval Operations partly based on his handling of the Morrison investigation. His confirmation hearings before the Senate had focused extensively on his commitment to preventing similar abuses and ensuring accountability at all levels of naval leadership. The Morrison case taught us that institutional reputation built on silence and cover-up is worthless. Admiral Thompson had testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee. True institutional strength comes from transparency, accountability, and the courage to confront our failures honestly. The Navy that emerges from this crisis will be stronger, more ethical, and more worthy of the trust placed in it by those who volunteer to serve. Thompson's leadership had been essential to sustaining the reforms through inevitable resistance from conservative elements within the service. Some senior officers had argued that public accountability damaged military effectiveness by undermining respect for authority and hierarchy. But Thompson had countered that authority not grounded in moral legitimacy was ultimately hollow, and that respect earned through fear was inferior to respect earned through demonstrated integrity. The international implications had been significant as well. Allied navies had studied the American response to systematic abuse, implementing similar reforms in their own services. The Morrison case had become a touchstone for military justice reform worldwide, with Sarah's decision to speak truth to power, inspiring service members in dozens of countries to report abuse they might otherwise have endured in silence. NATO military leadership conferences now routinely included sessions on preventing systematic abuse and protecting whistleblowers, with American officers sharing lessons learned from their institutional transformation. The case had enhanced, rather than damaged, America's military reputation internationally, demonstrating that democratic militaries had the courage to confront their own failures and implement meaningful reform. But the most meaningful changes were personal and individual. Maria Rodriguez had married a Coast Guard officer she'd met during her recovery, building a family while continuing her service as a victim advocate. Her children would grow up in a military family that understood both the nobility of service and the importance of moral courage when institutions failed to live up to their ideals. Amanda Williams had completed her master's degree in electrical engineering while serving as an instructor, her career stronger than it had been before the abuse that nearly destroyed it. She'd been selected for promotion to Senior Chief Petty Officer, a recognition of both her technical expertise and her leadership in helping other survivors rebuild their careers and their trust in the institution. Jennifer Kim, despite her medical retirement and ongoing health challenges, had found purpose in advocacy work with veterans, organizations. Her writing about military sexual trauma had been published in psychology journals and policy publications, contributing to national conversations about institutional accountability and survivor support. Her voice, silenced for so long by trauma and intimidation, had become one of the most powerful advocates for military justice reform. Even Chief Petty Officer Eduardo Rodriguez, Maria's father, had found a way to transform his family's pain into positive change. He'd become a senior instructor in the Navy's leadership development programs, using his experience as both a career sailor and the father of an abuse survivor to teach other senior enlisted personnel about their obligations to protect junior sailors. His classes were among the most requested in the Navy's professional development curriculum. The ripple effects extended far beyond military service. Sarah's mother, Professor Lisa Wong Chen, had incorporated the case into her sociology courses at San Francisco State University, using it to teach students about institutional change, individual agency, and the power of moral courage to catalyze systematic reform. Her academic research on military culture transformation had been published in leading journals and cited by researchers studying organizational change in various fields. Dr. Michael Chin, Sarah's father, had become involved with veterans, mental health organizations providing pro bono medical care to survivors of military sexual trauma. His work had led to improved understanding of the long-term health effects of institutional betrayal, contributing to better treatment protocols for survivors of systematic abuse within trusted institutions. The Morrison case had also inspired legislative action beyond military justice reform. Congress had passed the Institutional Accountability Act, requiring all federal agencies to implement independent reporting mechanisms for abuse and corruption, along with mandatory transparency requirements when systematic problems were discovered. The legislation was directly modeled on the military reforms that had emerged from Sarah's decision to speak truth to power. 2 years after Morrison's conviction, Sarah was selected to represent the Navy at a United Nations conference on institutional accountability and human rights. Her presentation to an international audience of military and civilian leaders focused not on the abuse she'd endured, but on the institutional transformation that had followed her decision to report it. Individual courage can spark institutional change, Sarah told the assembly, but only when institutions have the wisdom to respond with transparency rather than defensiveness, with accountability rather than cover-up, with reform rather than retaliation. The ultimate test of any institution's integrity isn't whether it makes mistakes, but how it responds when those mistakes are exposed. The speech was broadcast worldwide and translated into dozens of languages, inspiring similar accountability movements in militaries and civilian institutions across the globe. Sarah had become, despite her personal reluctance for public attention, a symbol of the power of individual integrity to catalyze systematic change. But her most significant impact remained within the Navy itself, in the countless young sailors who could now serve with confidence that their institution would protect rather than betray them. The burn marks on her body had faded to thin white lines barely visible unless specifically sought, but their legacy lived on in policies, procedures, and cultural changes that would protect generations of future service members. The USS Leviathan, under Captain Martinez's command, had become a model of positive military culture. The ship's operational performance had actually improved following the cultural transformation, as crew members who felt safe and respected proved more effective in their duties than those who'd served under fear and intimidation. Retention rates were higher, morale surveys consistently positive, and the ship had received commendations for both operational excellence and command climate. Admiral Hayes had announced her retirement for the end of the year, her career concluding with the satisfaction of having transformed an institution rather than simply served within it. Her final fitness report, written by Admiral Thompson, included a line that would define her legacy. Admiral Hayes chose institutional integrity over personal advancement, moral courage over political expediency, and the welfare of subordinates over the comfort of superiors. Her example will guide naval leadership for generations. The retirement ceremony was held aboard the USS Constitution in Boston Harbor, with hundreds of officers and enlisted personnel attending to honor a leader who demonstrated that true military strength came from moral courage rather than conventional power. Sarah was among those presenting awards to Admiral Hayes, their relationship having evolved from commander and subordinate to colleagues united in the ongoing work of institutional reform. "Admiral Hayes taught me that leadership isn't about commanding others," Sarah said during her remarks at the ceremony. "Leadership is about having the courage to do what's right, even when it's personally costly, even when it's institutionally uncomfortable, even when it challenges everything you've been taught about loyalty and obedience. She showed me that the highest form of military service is ensuring the military remains worthy of the trust placed in it." As Admiral Hayes left active duty, the reforms she'd championed were becoming embedded in naval culture, protected by new policies but sustained by a generation of leaders who understood that institutional integrity required constant vigilance. The Morrison case had become historical, but its lessons remained contemporary, taught to every new class of officers and enlisted personnel entering the service. The final measure of transformation came in the retention and promotion rates of women throughout the Navy. For the first time in the service's history, women were advancing to senior leadership positions at rates proportional to their representation in the overall force. Sexual assault reporting had increased dramatically, not because abuse was more prevalent, but because survivors now trusted that reporting would lead to justice rather than retaliation. Sarah's decision to lift her shirt in Admiral Hayes' office had lasted only seconds, but its consequences would endure for decades. The scars that had seemed like marks of shame had become symbols of courage, proof that individual integrity could triumph over institutional corruption, that moral courage could spark systematic change, that speaking truth to power remained one of the highest forms of patriotic service. The Navy that emerged from the Morrison crisis was stronger, more ethical, and more worthy of the trust placed in it by those who volunteered to serve. The transformation hadn't been completed overnight, and vigilance remained necessary to prevent backsliding. But fundamental change had been achieved, and the principles that had guided that change, transparency over secrecy, accountability over cover-up, justice over reputation, had become embedded in military culture. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen had kept her promise to herself and her fellow survivors. No other woman would have to endure in silence what they had suffered. The burns had healed, the scars had faded, but the courage that had exposed them to daylight continued to illuminate the path toward institutional integrity and individual dignity for all who wore the uniform. 5 years later, the lecture hall at the Naval War College in Newport was filled with senior officers from allied navies around the world, their uniforms representing a dozen different countries united in the study of military leadership and institutional accountability. At the podium stood Commander Sarah Chen, now bearing the oak leaves of her promotion and the quiet confidence of someone who had not only survived institutional betrayal, but had transformed it into institutional strength. The scars on her torso had faded to nearly invisible white lines, visible only to those who knew to look for them. But the courage that had first exposed those scars to Admiral Hayes 7 years earlier had only grown stronger, refined by experience and tempered by the responsibility of leadership. Sarah wore her dress blues with the natural bearing of a senior officer, her ribbon rack telling the story of a career built on technical excellence, moral courage, and unwavering commitment to protecting those she led. Institutional transformation, Sarah told the assembled international officers, doesn't begin with policy changes or leadership directives. It begins with individuals who choose conscience over career, truth over comfort, and the welfare of subordinates over personal advancement. But individual courage alone isn't sufficient. It must be met with institutional wisdom that chooses transparency over secrecy, accountability over cover-up. In the audience, Vice Admiral Patricia Hayes nodded with the satisfaction of a mentor watching a protege exceed all expectations. Hayes had returned to active duty after her retirement, Recalled by the Secretary of the Navy to serve as the first Director of Military Justice Reform, a position created specifically to sustain and expand the changes that had begun with the Morrison case. Her hair was now silver white, and her face bore the lines of someone who had fought significant battles, but her eyes still held the steel determination that had made her decision to call Washington on that October morning 7 years earlier. The transformation of military culture had become Hayes's final mission, and she'd approached it with the same methodical precision she'd brought to naval operations throughout her career. Under her leadership, the military justice reforms pioneered by the Navy had been adopted across all service branches, creating a unified approach to preventing and responding to systematic abuse. Congressional oversight had been institutionalized through permanent committees dedicated to military accountability, ensuring that civilian leadership remained engaged in protecting service members from institutional betrayal. But Hayes's most significant achievement had been cultural rather than structural. She'd helped create a generation of military leaders who understood that moral courage was as important as physical bravery, that protecting subordinates was as crucial as accomplishing missions, and that institutional integrity required constant vigilance against the abuse of power. In the third row of the lecture hall sat Captain Maria Rodriguez, now commanding her own ship after a career trajectory that had taken her from victim to advocate to leader. Her vessel, the USS Courage, had been named specifically to honor survivors of military sexual trauma, a symbolic recognition that courage took many forms, including the courage to speak truth to power when institutions failed their fundamental obligations. Rodriguez's command tour had been remarkably successful, with her ship receiving commendations for both operational excellence and positive command climate. She'd implemented innovative programs for preventing abuse and supporting survivors, creating a model that was being studied and replicated throughout the fleet. Her leadership style, forged in the crucible of personal trauma and institutional transformation, demonstrated that survivors could become powerful advocates for preventing others from enduring similar experiences. The international impact of the American military's transformation had been profound. NATO had adopted similar accountability standards for all member militaries, with regular inspections and reviews to ensure compliance with human rights protocols. The European Union had implemented comparable reforms for its emerging defense cooperation initiatives, using the Morrison case as a cautionary tale about the costs of institutional complacency. In Australia, the Defence Force had undertaken comprehensive reviews of its own culture and accountability mechanisms, discovering and addressing systematic problems that might otherwise have remained hidden for decades. The Canadian Armed Forces had restructured their approach to military justice, implementing independent oversight mechanisms that removed sexual assault cases from traditional command structures. Even non-allied nations had studied the American approach, recognizing that military effectiveness ultimately depended on the trust and confidence of service members. The principle that institutional strength came from transparency rather than secrecy had influenced military reform movements across the globe. From South Korea's efforts to address hazing in its conscript army, to Brazil's initiatives to prevent abuse in its expanding peacekeeping forces. The legislative legacy had been equally significant. The Military Justice Improvement Act had served as a model for civilian institutional accountability, inspiring similar reforms in corporations, universities, and other organizations where power imbalances created opportunities for systematic abuse. The principle that institutions must have independent mechanisms for investigating and addressing misconduct had become a standard requirement for organizations receiving federal funding or contracts. Sarah's presentation continued with case studies drawn from the years following the Morrison trial, illustrating how institutional transformation required sustained commitment rather than momentary reform. She described the challenges of maintaining accountability during personnel transitions, the importance of training programs that went beyond compliance to address cultural change, and the need for leadership selection processes that prioritized integrity alongside competence. The most important lesson we've learned, Sarah told her international audience, is that preventing systematic abuse requires proactive leadership rather than reactive policies. We cannot wait for victims to find the courage to report abuse. We must create cultures where abuse cannot take root, where bystanders are empowered to intervene, where leaders at every level understand their obligation to protect rather than exploit those they command. The audience included representatives from militaries still struggling with entrenched cultures of abuse and discrimination. A colonel from a South American army raised his hand during the question period, asking how to overcome resistance from senior personnel who viewed accountability measures as threats to traditional military hierarchy. Sarah's answer drew from hard-won experience. Change is always difficult, especially in institutions built on tradition and hierarchy. But we learned that the alternative to voluntary change is involuntary change imposed by external forces, congressional intervention, media exposure, public scandal that damages institutional credibility far more than honest self-examination ever could. Leaders who resist accountability measures aren't protecting military tradition, they're ensuring its destruction. The discussion continued for over an hour, with officers from various countries sharing their own experiences with institutional reform and the challenges of maintaining momentum for cultural change. The conversation revealed that the issues addressed by the American military's transformation were universal, present in militaries around the world, where power imbalances and institutional insularity created opportunities for abuse. 10 years later, the Pentagon's newest conference room was named the Hayes-Chen Center for Military Ethics, a permanent memorial to the partnership between senior leadership and individual courage that had transformed American military culture. The dedication ceremony had been attended by hundreds of current and former service members, including many who had been inspired by Sarah's example to report abuse or challenge institutional complacency in their own units. Admiral Sarah Chen, she'd been promoted to flag rank the previous year, stood before a mixed audience of military personnel, congressional representatives, academic researchers, and international observers. The ceremony was marking the 10th anniversary of Captain Morrison's conviction. But more importantly, it was celebrating a decade of sustained institutional transformation that had made the American military a global model for accountability and ethical leadership. The statistics told the story of remarkable change. Sexual assault rates in the military had declined by 70% over the decade, while reporting rates had increased dramatically as service members gained confidence that complaints would be investigated fairly and perpetrators held accountable. Retention rates for women and minorities had reached historic highs, reflecting growing trust that the military would protect rather than betray those who volunteered to serve. More significantly, the military had become a leader in institutional accountability across American society. Corporate executives, university administrators, and government officials regularly attended military ethics conferences to learn from the transformation that had followed the Morrison case. The principle that true institutional strength came from moral courage rather than conventional power had influenced leadership development across multiple sectors. Today we gather not to celebrate past achievements, Admiral Chen told the assembled crowd, but to recommit ourselves to the ongoing work of ensuring our institutions remain worthy of the trust placed in them. Transformation isn't a destination. It's a continuous journey that requires vigilance, courage, and the wisdom to acknowledge when we fall short of our ideals. In the audience sat dozens of officers who had been midshipmen when Sarah first taught at the Naval Academy, now serving as commanders and senior leaders throughout the fleet. Their careers had been shaped by the understanding that military leadership required moral courage as well as tactical competence, that protecting subordinates was as important as accomplishing missions, and that institutional integrity could never be taken for granted. Among them was Captain Jennifer Martinez, former aide to Admiral Hayes and current commanding officer of the USS Leviathan, the ship where the systematic abuse had first been exposed. Under Martinez's leadership, the Leviathan had become a flagship for positive military culture, with crew members volunteering for assignment because of its reputation for ethical leadership and professional excellence. The ship itself had been transformed from a symbol of institutional failure into a model of institutional success. Its crew included sailors from diverse backgrounds who served with confidence that their contributions would be valued and their welfare protected. The vessel's operational performance consistently exceeded fleet standards, demonstrating that ethical leadership enhanced rather than compromised military effectiveness. Captain Rodriguez, now serving as a senior staff officer at the Pentagon, had specialized in developing training programs that helped other militaries implement similar accountability reforms. Her work had taken her to over 30 countries, sharing lessons learned from the American transformation while learning from other nations, approaches to preventing institutional abuse. The most significant change, however, was generational. Officers and enlisted personnel who had entered service after the Morrison case had never known a military culture that tolerated systematic abuse or protected predators. For them, accountability was simply part of military professionalism. Transparency was expected rather than feared, and moral courage was understood as essential to effective leadership. This generational shift had created a self-reinforcing cycle of positive change. Young leaders who had been trained to prioritize institutional integrity continued that emphasis as they advanced through the ranks, creating a military culture fundamentally different from the one that had enabled Morrison's crimes. The transformation had become embedded in institutional DNA rather than remaining dependent on individual leadership or external oversight. Dr. Lisa Wong Chen, Sarah's mother, had become a leading researcher in institutional transformation, her academic work cited by scholars studying organizational change in various fields. Her book, Courage in Institutions: How Individual Integrity Sparks Systematic Change, had become required reading in business schools, public administration programs, and military academies worldwide. The personal costs of the transformation were remembered alongside its achievements. Jennifer Kim, the communications specialist whose career had been destroyed by abuse, had passed away 5 years earlier from complications related to her attempted suicide. Her death had served as a permanent reminder that institutional change, no matter how comprehensive, could not undo all the damage caused by systematic abuse. But Kim's legacy lived on in the Jennifer Kim Memorial Fund, which provided mental health support and career assistance to survivors of military sexual trauma. The fund, supported by donations from military personnel worldwide, had helped hundreds of survivors rebuild their lives and careers, ensuring that Kim's suffering contributed to preventing similar tragedies for others. Admiral Thompson, the former chief of naval operations who had supported the reforms from their inception, had retired to become president of a major veterans organization. His leadership had been crucial to sustaining political support for military justice reform during inevitable periods of resistance and backsliding. His memoir, Accountability and Honor: Leading Military Transformation, had become a standard text for senior military leaders grappling with institutional change. 15 years later, the Naval Academy's newest academic building was named Chen Hall, honoring Admiral Sarah Chen's contributions to military ethics and institutional accountability. The dedication ceremony was attended by her parents, now in their 80s but still proud of their daughter's courage in speaking truth to power and transforming an institution from within. Admiral Chen herself, now serving as superintendent of the Naval Academy, had come full circle from the frightened lieutenant who had lifted her shirt to show burn marks to Admiral Hayes. Her leadership of the Academy focused on preparing future officers not just for tactical and technical challenges, but for the moral complexities they would face throughout their careers. The Academy's curriculum had been fundamentally restructured to emphasize ethical decision-making alongside traditional military subjects. Every midshipman studied the Morrison case and similar examples of institutional failure, learning to recognize the warning signs of systematic abuse and understanding their obligation as future leaders to prevent such failures. But more importantly, they learned about moral courage, the strength to do what was right even when it was personally costly, even when it challenged traditional hierarchies, even when it required confronting respected superiors or beloved mentors. The Academy produced graduates who understood that true military strength came from integrity rather than intimidation, from transparency rather than secrecy, from accountability rather than cover-up. The International Military Academy Association had adopted similar curriculum standards, ensuring that future military leaders worldwide received training in institutional accountability and ethical leadership. Exchange programs allowed midshipmen from various countries to learn from each other's approaches to preventing abuse and maintaining institutional integrity. The transformation had extended beyond military institutions to influence civilian leadership development as well. Major corporations sent executives to study at military leadership programs that emphasized ethical decision-making and institutional accountability. Universities implemented similar approaches in their business and public administration schools, recognizing that the principles of moral courage and institutional integrity applied across all sectors of society. Admiral Chen's final assignment before retirement would be as the first Director of Institutional Accountability for the Department of Defense, a position created to ensure that the reforms of the past 15 years would be sustained and expanded for future generations. Her task would be to institutionalize the lessons learned from the Morrison case, creating permanent structures that would prevent similar systematic abuse regardless of changes in leadership or political climate. The scars on her body had become completely invisible, faded beyond detection by even the most careful observer. But their legacy remained visible in every policy, every training program, every leadership development initiative that prioritized protecting subordinates over protecting superiors. The courage that had first exposed those scars to daylight had become embedded in institutional culture, ensuring that future generations of service members would serve with dignity and safety. 20 years later, the retirement ceremony for Admiral Sarah Chen was held aboard the USS Constitution in Boston Harbor, the same venue where Admiral Hayes had been honored 2 decades earlier. The symbolism was intentional. Both women had demonstrated that true naval tradition meant constant renewal of commitment to justice and accountability, not blind adherence to practices that contradicted the Navy's fundamental values. The ceremony was attended by military leaders from around the world, congressional representatives, academic researchers, and hundreds of service members whose careers had been shaped by the institutional transformation that began with Sarah's decision to speak truth to power. The diversity of the crowd reflected the global impact of the reforms she had championed throughout her career. Fleet Admiral Maria Rodriguez, now the senior-most Hispanic woman in American military history, delivered the principal address. Her own journey from abuse victim to fleet commander embodied the transformation that had occurred within military culture, demonstrating that survivors could not only recover from institutional betrayal, but could become powerful advocates for preventing others from enduring similar experiences. 20 years ago, Rodriguez told the assembled crowd, Admiral Chen made a decision that changed not just her own life, but the lives of countless service members who would never even know her name. She chose courage over comfort, truth over safety, and the welfare of others over her own career advancement. That choice sparked a transformation that continues to this day, ensuring that no one who volunteers to serve our country will have to endure in silence what earlier generations suffered. The ceremony included presentations from international military leaders, whose own services had been transformed by the American example. The principle that institutional strength came from accountability rather than secrecy had influenced military reform movements worldwide, creating a global standard for military ethics and human rights protection. But the most meaningful tribute came from the youngest members of the audience, midshipmen and junior officers who had never known a military culture that tolerated systematic abuse. For them, the accountability and transparency that had once seemed revolutionary were simply normal aspects of military professionalism. They served in a military that had been fundamentally transformed by one woman's decision to lift her shirt and show the burn marks that proved institutional failure. Sarah's retirement speech focused not on past achievements, but on future challenges. Military culture required constant vigilance to prevent backsliding, continuous education to maintain ethical standards, and ongoing commitment to choosing institutional integrity over institutional reputation. The work of transformation was never complete, requiring each generation of leaders to make their own choice between courage and complicity. The burns have healed, Admiral Chen said in closing, but the courage that exposed them must never fade. Every leader in every generation must be prepared to choose truth over comfort, accountability over cover-up, and the welfare of subordinates over personal advancement. That choice defines not just individual character but institutional integrity. As Admiral Chen departed active duty, she carried with her the satisfaction of having transformed not just an institution but a culture, not just policies but principles, not just procedures but people. The frightened lieutenant who had once hidden cigarette burns beneath her uniform had become a leader whose courage had inspired institutional transformation that would protect countless future generations. Hey, the USS Leviathan, now commanded by Captain Jessica Park, a Korean-American officer whose career had been made possible by the opportunities created through military diversity initiatives, continued to serve as a symbol of positive transformation. The ship's crew included sailors from every background and demographic, united in their commitment to professional excellence and mutual respect. The burn marks were gone, invisible even to trained medical examination, but their legacy lived on in every policy that protected whistleblowers, every training program that emphasized moral courage, every leadership development initiative that prioritized integrity over advancement. The scars had become symbols not of victimization but of the courage to transform victimization into victory, suffering into strength, and individual trauma into institutional healing. The story of Lieutenant Sarah Chen and the burn marks that changed a nation's military would be taught to future generations of service members, not as historical curiosity, but as living example of the power of individual courage to spark systematic change. Each new class of midshipmen would learn that military service meant more than following orders. It meant having the courage to challenge orders when they violated fundamental principles of human dignity and institutional integrity. The Navy that emerged from Sarah's courage was stronger, more ethical, and more worthy of the trust placed in it by those who volunteered to serve. The transformation had required sacrificing careers, challenging traditions, and confronting uncomfortable truths about institutional failure. But the result was a military that truly embodied the values it claimed to represent, an institution worthy of the sacrifices made by those who wore its uniform. Admiral Sarah Chen's final entry in her personal journal, written on the night of her retirement ceremony, captured the essence of her journey. The burns have healed, but the courage that exposed them must never fade. In choosing to lift my shirt and show those scars, I discovered that individual integrity can triumph over institutional corruption, that moral courage can spark systematic change, and that speaking truth to power remains one of the highest forms of patriotic service. The scars are gone, but their legacy will endure as long as people choose courage over complicity, truth over comfort, and justice over silence. The flame of courage that had been kindled in Admiral Hayes' office 20 years earlier continued to burn brightly, carried forward by generations of leaders who understood that true military strength came not from the power to command, but from the integrity to deserve command. The burns had healed, the scars had faded, but the courage that exposed them to daylight continued to illuminate the path toward institutional integrity and individual dignity for all who wore the uniform. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd dispersed into the Boston twilight, the legacy of Lieutenant Sarah Chen's courage lived on in the countless lives that had been protected by her decision to speak truth to power. The systematic abuse that had once flourished in darkness had been exposed to light, transformed from institutional failure into institutional strength, from individual trauma into collective healing. The Navy sailed on, forever changed by one woman's decision to lift her shirt and show burn marks that demanded justice. Her courage had sparked a transformation that would endure as long as people understood that individual integrity could triumph over institutional corruption, that moral courage could change the world, and that sometimes the greatest act of service was refusing to serve in silence when service demanded speaking truth to power. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.